All right, we're going to talk about Gardner's Chapter 6, Crime Scene Photography. Uh, what we're not going to do here is we're not going to have a really big discussion as to the technical aspects of photography. That's something that's best served to several other classes in this curriculum. Instead, we're going to talk about how crime scene photography relates to crime scene documentation. So, in this chapter, there are certain objectives, and they are to identify the four elements of crime scene documentation, to identify and explain the four recurring problems associated to crime scene photography. We're going to also identify and explain the purpose of the three basic types of crime scene photographs. We're also going to identify the three elements of camera control that affect the quality of crime scene photographs, and we're going to explain the proper use of the video camera in crime scene documentation. Photography comes as a subset of the documentation phase of Gardner's 6 crime scene activities. After you've conducted your assessment and you've observed uh, the crime scene, the evidence, and how it all interplays with each other, you are then going to document what you've seen. While you're taking notes constantly throughout your crime scene process, you're going to be taking photographs next because you want to capture the scene exactly the way it was found. And by doing it after you've conducted your assessment and observation, you're able to do that while the scene is relatively pristine. As I mentioned before, there's four key elements in crime scene documentation. Note taking, which you're going to be doing constantly throughout the crime scene process. Photography, which has to be conducted at specific times. After photography comes sketches, and then finally you're going to be writing a report. The report is going to be written more than likely off-site with the use of your photographs and your notes. Now, the reason why this is a series of steps is because notes, photographs, sketches, and reports capture different elements of the crime scene. They all complement each other, and one cannot exist without the other. Now, our objective of crime scene photography is that we want to establish a visual record of the crime scene as we found it. And this includes where the items were at the time it was found. Now, this sounds real simple. However, there's a number of recurring problems that happen in crime scene photography. Now, these recurring problems that I've spoken about in the previous slide are things such as identification issues, orientation issues, confusion issues, and incomplete documentation issues. And any one of these can really take away from the story that you're trying to tell. We're going to discuss each one of these particular items in turn. Let's start with identification issues. And this is basically what happens when you look at a picture and you don't know what the photographer is trying to say. And this happens a lot with people taking random pictures inside a crime scene just to say they did. This is now, while you may read in some classes and perhaps even in this textbook, there's no such thing as too many photographs. There's other authors and other people that beg to differ. For example, Robinson writes in his book Crime Scene Photography that yes, you can take too many photographs, especially when you're taking random pictures of things. Then people tend to get lost in the scene. They ask themselves, why is this important? That's not the question you want your jury to be asking, or your judge, or your prosecutor. Now, here's an example of just such a problem. First off, does anybody know what it is? Okay, based on what I'm seeing, this is, or at least what appears to be, a fragment from a bullet that was fired. I could be wrong. And that's the problem with the identification issue. We don't know what they're trying to capture here. We don't even know if it's part of the scene. So this is an example of one of these random photographs that are taken, but yet nobody knows what we're trying to say here in this photograph. Then there's orientation issues. Again, this causes people to become lost in the scene where as we saw in that previous photograph, there is no orientation. We have no idea whether it was on this scene or whether it was on another scene. So we need to understand not only which way is up, but where this particular item is in relation to the rest of the crime scene. Again, this is another reason why you can take too many photographs, especially if you take photographs of random items. Here's an example of just such an orientation issue. Now, this appears to be a bloodstain pattern. The question is, which way is up and what surface is it on? These items can become very important, especially if you're a bloodstain pattern analyst and you're trying to determine or reconstruct events based upon bloodstain pattern interpretation. This particular pattern, if it was on the ceiling or if it was on the wall or on the floor, can drastically affect the story that an analyst is trying to reconstruct. Then we have confusion issues, and these happen when the viewer of the photograph isn't clear of what item is being photographed or what photo came first. Oftentimes you'll see where the scene is in altered states, or they'll show multiple items that look the same, but there's no way to tell which item is which. Here's an example of a confusion issue. If you look at the photograph at the right, did this photograph come first or was it the one at the left? Who brought in the coffee cup? Was the coffee cup brought in by a responding officer, or was the coffee cup there as part of the original scene? One of the things that you can do to avoid confusion issues is to complete a photo log. Some departments may not require them. The departments that I was from, the agencies I was from, all required a photo log to be submitted with your photographs. In fact, if you fail to do so, then you would end up with disciplinary action of your own. So my suggestion to you is to complete a photo log whenever you complete a series of photographs. Then there's incomplete documentation. And this happens when pertinent details are not captured. One example of which is too few photographs are taken and critical areas of the scene are forgotten. These could have been avoided if you do a proper scene assessment and you've observed everything there is in the scene. This can also be avoided if you have a methodical, systematic technique. And we're going to talk about just such a technique later on in this presentation. This, however, does not give you license to take a bunch of random photographs. As we talked about before, the crime scene photo log eliminates many of these issues we've talked about. And this is a log of photographs that you've taken in any particular assignment. It has spaces for administrative data, what time the photos were taken, what they show, and other pertinent details. This here is a representation of a generic crime scene photo log. Now, having said that, if you were to go to the website www.imprimus.net, they have a generic photo log which is quite useful. So useful, in fact, that my former agency adopted it as a standard form. That particular document gives you everything you need to adequately document a series of photographs taken during an incident. Now let's talk about what type of crime scene photographs are being taken. There's three basic types. And if you maintain this methodology, you're bound to document everything in the scene. Number one is overall photographs. The next type is evidence establishing photographs, or mid-range photographs as they are sometimes called. And then thirdly, we have evidence close-up photographs. We'll speak of each one in turn. Now, overall photographs are designed to get an overall view of the room and to capture it the way it was found. Now, depending on who you ask, there's different ways of doing it. Gardner recommends taking them with a wide-angle lens. Robinson and Young and Ortmeyer recommend taking those photographs with a normal lens. So a lot of it is going to depend upon what equipment you have at your agency. My personal recommendation would be to expose them with a normal lens, because that's going to give you a perspective of what you've seen, as opposed to using a wide angle lens, which has a field of view that's larger, artificially so, than a normal human eye. These overall photographs will also help you to eliminate issues of contamination, such as, was the blood tracked in, or was it there when you found it? Overall photographs are taken by standing in one corner of the room, pointing towards the opposite corner, focusing, and shooting the picture. And you'll do that with every other corner in the room. This is a graphic example of just how to shoot a four-corner overall exposure. You'll stand in one corner, aim the camera at the opposite corner, and make your exposure. And then you'll move to the subsequent corner and repeat the process. The idea of which is you're going to be creating four overlapping fields of view that are going to capture the scene as it was originally found. And this here is a representation of a mock-up room and the overall photographs taken. You'll notice each one has a different viewer vantage point. In fact, you'll be able to see that on the floor there's an item of evidence in overall photograph number one. But number two also documents other parts of the scene as well. And again, subsequently, in overall photographs 3 and 4, you're seeing additional evidence that's documented as well. So all four of these photographs taken in series will provide you with a view of everything in the room. Once the overall photographs are taken, you'll then move on to the evidence establishing or mid-range photograph. Gardner recommends that these are photographed with a 50mm lens, or a normal lens for those using digital cameras. Generally speaking, a 50mm lens is a normal for a 35mm camera. However, those cameras are becoming harder and harder to support. So more and more agencies are moving to digital. On many digital cameras that are often used, a 25 to 28mm setting usually indicates a normal setting for a digital camera. When you take that picture, the photographer has to frame that item of evidence with a landmark in the scene. That's why it's referred to as an evidence establishing photograph. And as you probably guessed, they're often overlooked. You may find some inexperienced photographers who just take a bunch of random pictures in the scene and they hope they get enough to adequately document it. And more often than not, it doesn't work. So, I repeat, after you take those overall photographs, you next want to take the evidence establishing photographs. Now, this photograph is not intended to show details on the evidence, but rather to establish it in the frame. Now, the photograph you're seeing right here is more of a close-up evidentiary photograph and not a evidence establishing or mid-range photograph, because one of the things it doesn't have is some frame of reference in the crime scene itself. This blue background could correspond to any number of things. In fact, if you were to look at the Formica cabinets in the forensic lab, you'll find it looks very similar. Now, the photograph on the right is a proper evidence establishing photograph. Normally this would be taken with and without placards. Now, item 4 represents the entry where the entry hole where the bullet came into this file box, while item 10 is where the deformed bullet was found. And since it probably cannot be photographed where it sits, it has to be photographed in the manner that you see in the left-hand photograph. Evidence establishing photographs are the final series of photographs that you'll be taking. These are often done with a macro lens, which could vary in focal length. Your department, however, may not have a macro lens, and you may have to use a series of accessory close-up lenses that screw onto the front of your camera. Whatever way you choose, or whatever way you are required to use it, the idea is to allow the viewer to see all the detail that's present on that item of evidence. And that means you're going to have to get close and fill the frame with it. Of course, these are also taken with and without a scale. The idea of which is, if you photograph with the scale and not without a scale, you invite the defense to claim that you tampered with the scene. Now, this is an example of a properly executed evidence close-up photograph. And as I mentioned before, you'll want to take a picture of this with and without a scale. You also want to get close and fill the entire frame of the camera with the evidence. Since this is particularly small, you want to make sure that the evidence identifier, the number 10 that you see, also is included in the same reference as the expended bullet. Here's another example of an evidence close-up photograph. You have an item here that's a blood stain. You have to make sure that your blood stain photograph is focused well, because an examiner is going to use both the blood stain and this scale to determine the angle of impact. If either of these are not in focus, that's going to drastically affect his interpretation. Now, to photograph a crime scene, you want to document the entire crime scene as it sits, which is what in situ means, as it sits as soon as possible using your overall photographs. The next thing you want to photograph is all your fragile evidence, any evidence that may become destroyed or displaced, using mid-range and close-up photographs. While you're documenting that scene, you photograph all your known evidence using evidence establishing and evidence close-ups, and then as you find additional evidence during your crime scene search, you'll have to return, document, and take additional overall and evidence establishing photographs prior to seizing the item. If you're doing additional processes, you're going to have to create photographs that demonstrate the results of those processes, such as latent prints, blood stain patterns, and firearm trajectory analysis. And you may be getting out this is where you may be photographing using lasers, using photographic fog, or using strings or other assorted processes. Now, always use a reference card or slate, as it's sometimes called, on the first shot of each assignment. Now, Gardner refers to each roll. Nowadays, with digital photographs being used so much, it's a good practice to make the first shot in your incident your reference card or slate. And this demonstrates certain data such as agency, incident number, date, time, and so forth. In fact, the agency I came from made it a standing order that if an officer were to take a series of digital photographs and did not include a reference card, he would be subject to discipline. Also, it's a good practice to always use a crime scene photo log for the reasons that we've already talked about. Now, some quality control issues require that the investigator be thoroughly familiar with their equipment before they go out and use it on a real case. And this involves knowing how to physically control the camera, how to control your light, and how do you control your focus and depth of field. Okay, let's talk a little bit about physical control of the camera. I'm not going to get into too much detail, as this should have been covered in your digital photography class, but this does bear a certain amount of repeating. Number one, good photography always starts with a stable camera. If you can't get your camera shake resolved, you cannot take a sharp photograph. Generally speaking, at shutter speeds that are 1/60th of a second or higher, you can handhold the camera. There are other photographers who are practiced enough and can handhold below 1/60th of a second, but these are people with a certain amount of training and experience, and I don't recommend this if you're a beginning photographer. As a general rule, anything below 1/60th of a second, which would be 1/30th and slower, a tripod is necessary. And I would add not only a tripod, but also a camera remote control is necessary to stabilize the camera. And here's why. If you were to have a camera on a tripod and you were shooting it at speeds of 1/30th of a second or slower, the mere act of pressing the shutter button is going to be enough to cause motion blur and shake. And then finally, if you are doing any close-up photography, a tripod is an absolute must, because that tripod is going to allow you to take excellent macro photographs without any blurring or shaking. I can't stress this enough because I've seen it plenty of times in classes where students tell me, oh yeah, this is a great photograph, this is a great photograph, and they try to handhold at 1/30th of a second, 1/15th of a second, and less, and the photographs come out blurred. And then they continually blame the camera. Well, it's not the camera's fault, it's the execution. This particular image shows a properly executed UPI grip. If you'll look at the image on the left side of the screen, you'll see that the camera is supported with your left hand underneath the lens. The right hand is near the shutter release. The elbows are tucked in, and you have eyebrow contact with the camera itself. So it's a nice, stable platform. Next, we'll talk about controlling light. Good lighting is absolutely necessary for adequately documenting a crime scene. And sometimes you may have to bring your own light. And this doesn't mean the built-in flash that comes with your digital camera or the built-in flashes that you see on CSI. I always see those and I think to myself, this is an absolute joke, because there's no way that this little flash is going to expose this much scene. Generally speaking, those little flashes that are built into your digital camera are only going to give you about maybe 8 feet of range on a really good day. This is where you get out the big purpose-filled flash and you use different things such as bounce and diffusion techniques. Again, these are subjects best left for discussions during the photography classes in your curriculum. Finally, controlling focus and depth of field. As I usually explain on the first day of my digital photography classes and my digital image processing classes at this university, I explain to my students that I can correct a number of sins in Photoshop. Focusing is not one of them. So this is where I suggest where people would turn off their automatic focusing, use that the manual focus ring, not the zoom ring, but there's a manual focus ring, and it's usually the most forward ring on the lens itself. And then maximize your depth of field. In order to maximize your depth of field, you may have to use a f-stop setting that is particularly small, and that's going to require a slower shutter speed in response. This is an example of depth of field. The left-hand side is a poor depth of field. If you'll notice that placard number 1 is focused, but everything else is gradually out of focus. The camera was set at an aperture of f3.8. Not much, in fact, no depth of field really to speak of. The one on the right has good depth of field because the aperture was set at f8. f8 is generally the beginning of where you see good depth of field. Now it is darker, so you're going to have to compensate for less light entering the image sensor by using a slower shutter speed. And then finally, video photography. Video photography, well, a number of agencies will use it. It's always used as a supplement to crime scene photographs. It doesn't replace the conventional photograph. It doesn't replace the conventional report, notes, or anything else. It is just a supplement. And for all practical purposes, you almost never see a video coming out unless there is a homicide. And there's a number of reasons why. If you do find yourself using video, you generally want to turn off your audio unless you intend to narrate. And generally speaking, you want to leave it off anyway. You also don't want to move, pan, or zoom the camera too quickly because your viewer is going to get dizzy when they watch this. Finally, if you're using any sort of supplemental lighting, and pretty much you should anytime you have an indoor scene or it's dark, you want to use a video light that is intended for that purpose. High power flashlights like law enforcement uses are not intended to do that. In fact, what they will do is they will distort your colors in your scene. So it's good practice that when an agency is purchasing a video camera, they also purchase a video light. Now, I believe this concludes our discussion of crime scene photography. Again, our intention here is to discuss where it fits into the documentation scheme and not necessarily as a supplement or as a replacement for the term-long classes that we have in digital photography. If you have any questions, you can refer to the appropriate chapter in Gardner, or you can send your questions to the instructor.